Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and this afternoon I finished reading Alan Garner's novel Redshift, which I really enjoyed. I did. I really liked this book. It was weird. It was sort of the perfect book to read after Foucault's Pendulum. It hit some of those same themes, psychogeography, patterns, cyclical history. But it did it all in 200 pages, and it was very concise. It compressed all the action, all the emotion, all of our characters' thoughts into those 200 pages in a very authentic way that pulled my mind with, all of the sort of the maelstrom that each character is in across 3 separate timelines. So it seems complex, right? 200 pages, 3 timelines. How the heck does that happen? Let's get into Redshift. Let's talk about Redshift, not the cosmological phenomenon. I'll possibly mention that at the end of the video if I remember to, but let's talk about the book. So we have 3 timelines. They all center around the same location, the Malcop, which is, I believe, either in Cheshire or like right on the border of Cheshire in the West Midlands, Northwest England. I'm not entirely sure on where Cheshire would be considered the Malcop. It's a folly castle. I'll talk about what that is a little bit later. And so we have our about half of the page count, because the narratives are split up, like interspersed, with the 3 timelines are interspersed throughout the book in a very clean, clear way where it's not particularly confusing. It's not certainly The Sound and the Fury for 70 pages. The about half the page count gets spent with a young adolescent couple. They're 18, 19, seem to be either finishing secondary education, Tom and Jan. So Jan, they're from different backgrounds. Jan is, her parents are doctors, and sort of almost like somewhat celebrity doctors. And she's studying to be a nurse, so they're from a slightly wealthier background. She's moving to London. Tom is very well read, he seems very knowledgeable, but he's also very unhappy. He feels trapped, and also that he can't really trust anybody or be himself around anyone. He repeatedly makes like very intelligent jokes or references, puns, but you can also tell he's unhappy, and he's sort of torn apart with how he feels. He frequently makes a reference, Tom's a cold, which is an allusion to King Lear, and sort of acts as a key like throughout the book. So we have Tom and Jan, and they will go, when she comes back from London on the train on the weekend, they will ride their bikes out to a small church and village where they can see the Malcop. Then we have, kind of chronologically moving backwards, we have a small village that's within sight of the Malcop in 17th century England during the English Civil War. Within that village, there's a small group of people who are sort of trying to hold out and know that they're sort of under siege. They're going to be sort of trapped in a church there, and it's based on a historical event where there was sort of an infamous massacre of men who had surrendered. And then moving farther back, we've got a group of about 4 survivors from the Roman 9th Legion that disappears from the historical record, possibly was wiped out in Britain during the reign of Hadrian and led to the construction of Hadrian's Wall. And so that's sort of what Garner, the hypothesis Garner just runs with. And so we have those 3 timelines. Anytime there's a timeline switch, the text is in you have normal paragraphs, and then there'll be a break between paragraphs, that extra white line, and that's how you know you're in a timeline switch. And it's usually pretty easy to navigate which timeline you're in. It's not a mystery. But there's really weird, interesting things. So in the 2nd century AD timeline, the characters, was written in the early 1970s, the characters speak in the way that United States GIs would speak to each other during the Vietnam War, or like in the media, in films or books or things. So there's that aspect where they're talking about clicks, like, oh, there's a village 6 clicks north, and all these things like that. It's just, so that's very intentionally anachronistic. Aspects of Cheshire dialect are interspersed throughout the book, but at one point the Roman soldiers want to go, they actually say go tribal instead of go native, go tribal, and so they quiz each other around some of the dialect vocabulary. The other, so they all have the Malcop as this central structure, but the other piece that's important is there's a ceremonial axe head that runs throughout all 3 narratives. So one of the characters in the 2nd century has it. One of the characters in the 17th century finds it and puts it somewhere, and it's then found by Tom and Jan in 1970, and they keep it as like sort of a totem to pass between each other when they're away, so that they can feel, connected and feel that they really do trust and love each other. So there were plenty of things to enjoy. None of the stories have necessarily like happy endings. Like, you have this horrifying story going on in the 2nd century where the Roman soldiers just think that they need to be like cruel and barbaric to blend in, and so they commit atrocities. They destroy a village, and then they take one woman, and there's never graphic descriptions, never particular graphic descriptions of like violence or sexual violence or rape in the book, but it's very clear that it happens. And so they take this woman who's a priestess, and they're camped out around where the Malkop will be built. In the 17th century, you have this sort of siege almost going on, and the character Tom and Thomas, he seems to have like seizures or that the other villagers regard as visions. And then of course Tom is not like not someone who's in a place at that point to have a healthy relationship. So I wanted to do a couple of readings to kind of give an indication of what's going on in this book. Let's see. So they're talking about where Tom and Jan are talking about where they're at. He put his head on her shoulder. "I couldn't stand it if you went now," he said. They walked from the motorway fence along a spit of sand between the lakes. "Grotti is excessively ugly," said Tom. "A corruption of grotesque. It won't last." "I love you." "I'm not sure about the mean galactic velocity. We're with M31, M32, M33, and a couple of dozen other galaxies. They're the nearest. What did you say?" "I love you." "Yes." He stopped walking. "That's all we can be sure of. We are, at this moment, somewhere between the M6 going to Birmingham and M33 going nowhere. Don't leave me." "Hush," said Jan. "It's all right." "It's not. How did we meet? How could we? Between the M6 and M33, think of the odds. In all space and time. I'm scared." "Don't be. Scared of losing. You're not." And so you can see right away, that's page 3. You can see right away, Tom is, asked, where are we? He wants to give precise definitions to everything. Where are they, in England? Where are the, how is the Earth traveling within the solar system? How is the solar system traveling within the galaxy? How is the galaxy traveling within the universe and galaxy clusters? And so he repeatedly is one of those people who will, like, as a character, he'll be asked a question, he gives plenty of smart aleck responses. But he also will have these like interactions that slip in that are more human, like, "What did you say? I love you," and how vulnerable he is. As an example of what's going on in that 2nd century timeline, Logan, who has some parallels where he is somewhat like Tom's dad. He's referred to as the Sergeant Major, which is Tom's father was in the military, and so he calls him the Sergeant Major. Logan took out of his cloak a small wheel from a horse trapping. It was held between 2 prongs like the rowel of a spur. "You keep looking at Mintaka and catch hold of that sword now." Face gripped the harness and pressed his head and body against the opposite side of the tree. Logan spun the wheel, flickering starlight. He stroked the rim with an accustomed measure, evenly turning the spokes, their invisible shadows glimmering Macy's eye. The voices at the camp argued, but there was no alarm. "Go, Macy. Mintaka, baby. Go, kid." Macy shook. "Go, baby, go." The hand caressed. The wheel spun. "Go, baby." Face frowned at Logan, puzzled. Mintaka, stay loose, kid. You gotta go." Macy's eye was opening. Logan stopped speaking. The sound between them was the thin ring of the wheel. And so Logan he recreates a traumatic event from Macy's childhood to force the character to go into sort of the Viking berserker mode, where he can then, even the odds when they're having to fight a larger group. And so he is very much trying to control Macy and force this character to like go into this sequence and commit violence really against his will. And so for Macy, the narrative is about connecting with the young woman they captured and who they're keeping as a prisoner, and she's a priestess, and her, like, their interaction and their humanity combining so that he's separated from the control Logan has over him. But I did want to read this section where it talks a little bit about the Malkop. And so Jan points out, "That's where I'd like to try for one day," said Jan. "I see it from the train, and then I know you're near. It looks like a lonely old man sitting up there." "We'll go," said Tom, "but I doubt if it'll be today, unless you feel like running." "Is it a castle?" "A folly, not real. It's called Malkop." "I like mountains. Can we go, even if it is only a folly?" "Sure," I said, "but how about something closer for today?" And so they walk to a church, and they're spending time in there. And then they meet with the rector, and so the rector, of course, thinks that they're there to sleep with each other, which they aren't. And he's kind of, "What are you doing here?" Tom goes, "We were very impressed by the water stoop by the north door," said Tom, "and the tympanum on the exterior of the chancel." The rector looked at Tom as if for the first time. "But if I may say so, the execution of the flight into Egypt on the south panel of the altar is one of the finest pieces of Tudor carving in my experience. The vernacular detail is delightful. I would hazard a guess that the font cover is of the same period." "What is your college?" said the rector. "Mine is Keys." "I haven't gone up yet," said Tom. "It's a choice between 3 at the moment." "Ah." And so Tom is able to just sort of like wheel and deal with strangers, but he struggles so much to connect with Jan. And like I said, there's not necessarily happy endings across it, but it is a narrative in which characters try to discover their humanity or rediscover their humanity. And so I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the psychogeography aspect to it. A couple of books that it reminded me of, and then I'll share a quick story and talk about Redshift. It absolutely reminded me, as I've been reading Benji's section from The Sound and the Fury, of that, except it was so much easier to read. The aspects of like moving across time and almost the characters being reincarnations of each other to a certain extent remind me a little bit of some of the Bran chapters in A Dance of Dragons or in the Game of Thrones show. Quick spoiler alert, the famous Hold the Door Hodor scene where Bran is in multiple timelines and affecting characters' minds. That very much felt like something that was happening in Redshift. In terms of other aspects of that, it reminded me of Kings in the Night, the great Kull, Bran, Morn story by Robert E. Howard. And even David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, sort of that repeating cyclical nature with the characters. So very quickly, my own connection to psychogeography and the objects of like the axe head, it reminded me of my dad's old chisel. In part because, so I've now lived more of my life without my father alive than with my father alive, and he was a carpenter and a contractor. So I still have a lot of his old tools that I learned to use before he passed away when I was 16. And so I still frequently use his chisel for different like projects around the house or things. And one of the things I'll use it for is to chip old glue off of old books that I find or that we have in order to like re-glue the spines and pages and repair and the binding and repair them. And so my older daughter, who's 4 now, she has seen me do it and like helps hold the chisel. So when I use the chisel, of course, I think of my father. And she's never met her grandfather, but as we use his chisel, we kind of have these conversations, or it brings out this idea of like the way that memories get sort of imprinted on an object. So anyways, that was my quick, anecdote connecting to Redshift and the axe head that travels through the 3 different timelines. But in terms of the Redshift, that is something that happens. So if you know the Doppler effect, where as the siren is getting closer, it sounds closer, and then as it's leaving, the sound changes. Well, light does the same thing, and so cosmological redshift is the idea that the universe is expanding, and so the light waves are shifting their wavelength as they appear to shift their wavelength as they move away, and so we see a redshift. And Tom is feeling that separation from Jan, and so he jokes about how he's so blue that he needs a redshift. That's his science pun, linguistically. But the reality is he's experiencing a redshift because they're separated from each other, and he wants them to become closer together, which would be the opposite of a redshift. Tomorrow's the first day of school. I'm wearing my red battle shirt. The calculus cavalry are arriving. And so anyways, Redshift by Alan Garner. I don't know if anybody else has ever read it. I really enjoyed it and I recommend it. Thanks, everybody.